After all, tradition claims that the Shroud of Turin is nothing less than the burial cloth of Christ. Even the 12th century is still 1100 years after the death of Jesus. But pressure on the reliability of the carbon-14 test has continued to build, with new forensic evidence that places the shroud yet further back in time. It is something known as the Sudarium of Oviedo in Spain. It is reputed to be the face cloth mentioned in the Gospel of John. John says that the disciples entered the tomb of Jesus on the third day after his death, only to find it empty, apart from the burial cloth and the face cloth. We also know from official records in Oviedo that the Sudarium can be accurately dated to the 5th century AD. I've invited to Turin Mark Guscin, an expert on the Sudarium of Oviedo in Spain. His evidence could push the date of the Turin shroud back another 700 years to the 5th century. This is an identical copy of the Sudarium. Its purpose was to trap blood escaping from the corpse as it was taken away for burial. Guscin believes he's identified significant evidence linking the Sudarium to the Shroud of Turin. Guscin already knew that the shroud has real blood. It belongs to the rare group AB. There are also traces of blood shed in life and blood shed in death. And finally, there are the unmistakable traces of blood from a crown of thorns on the front of the head and the back. Guscin believes all three blood features can be found on the Sudarium.
The first is the blood group, which is a relatively rare blood group on the planet. It's the blood group AB, and it's the same blood group of human blood on both cloths. Then there's also the differentiation between lifeblood, in other words, blood shed in life, and post-mortem blood, which can be clearly differentiated. And again, that coincides on both cloths. And that brings us to what, for me, clinches the whole matter of the cloths being used on the same body. Now, this was blood shed in life, while the man in question was still alive. Now, this blood comes from wounds that were made by some kind of sharp object piercing the skin in this area of the nape of the neck. Perfectly compatible with what has been called since then a crown of thorns. Now, if we look at this, we have exactly the same stains in the same area on the Shroud of Turin. Now, the actual shape of the stains, if you do an overlay of the two, well, the actual shape, the way the blood flowed coincides on both cloths.
So what you're saying is not only the blood types that are the same, the actual patterns of the blood on both cloths can be matched.
That's right. That's exactly so.
Amazing.
Which has led more than one qualified forensic doctor to say that the only conclusion you can make from that is that both cloths were used on the same body. In other words, it's too much for a simple coincidence.
But so let me understand, what you're saying is that the fact that we know exactly what happened to the Sudarium and its history has huge implications for the shroud, because obviously they both covered the same man.
That's right. And the only place that they could have coincided in time was in Jerusalem, sometime before the 4th or the 5th century. There's no two ways about that. They couldn't have coincided at any given time after that.
Because we know what happens to the
exactly where the Sudarium was all the time.
These very distinctive wounds on the back of the head on the shroud link it to the Sudarium in Jerusalem before 500 AD. The Turin shroud's links with the Shroud of Constantinople pushed its date back nearly 2 centuries. Its links with the Sudarium of Oviedo push it back by another 700 years. To be sure, none of these links necessarily make it the true Shroud of Christ. It might be that it's a 5th century fake. But there is a third shroud, the one described in the Gospels, which wrapped the body of Christ in Jerusalem after his crucifixion. Could the Shroud of Turin be that shroud? That would be the most contentious connection of all. for it would make the date of the Shroud of Turin 1,300 years older than the date indicated by the carbon-14 test. And yet, that's what new findings in Colorado are hinting at. The team studying the Shroud of Turin have identified a number of links to the Shroud of Jerusalem. First-century Jewish burial cloths, as today, had to conform to strict Jewish rules and regulations. First, they had to be linen, uncontaminated by wool. Rebecca Jackson is Jewish herself, and she's found that the cloth used for the Shroud of Turin conforms precisely.
According to Jewish law, you cannot mix linen and wool in the same fabric that will be touched. It's absolutely illegal. And that goes back way back into Egyptian culture, you know, the temple laws of ancient Egypt. And the shroud is definitely linen with some traces of cotton that could have slipped in there. But that's fine.
And that's okay?
That's okay. You can mix linen and cotton forever and ever, but you can't mix linen and wool.
Rebecca Jackson told me of another very specific link with Jewish culture.
This is 1 cubit.
Okay.
And this is 2 cubits.
Okay. So this is what would have been used as a tool of measurement, right?
Right.
So let's check it out. That's 2 cubits in width, certainly, right? And across, yeah, that's 1. That's 2. Point there. 3. The shroud's dimensions are in the units used in Jerusalem at the time of Christ, the cubit. What does that suggest to you then?
The whole thing checks out in terms of the measurement
Yeah.
of the shroud in the cubit.
The shroud has many of the hallmarks of a Jewish burial cloth. And Dr. Jackson believes there is evidence that connects the shroud directly to the shroud in the Gospels. The most detailed account of what the disciples saw in the empty tomb is the Gospel of John. He mentions the face cloth, but he also mentions burial cloths in the plural. That must include the shroud that wrapped the corpse, but the plural indicates that there was yet another cloth, and that has puzzled New Testament scholars. Well, Jackson believes he has identified the other cloth in the shroud itself, in a strip of cloth sewn along one side.
This is a transmitted image. It's a transmitted light image. It's an absorption image.
And the shroud is being held up. Jackson owns this backlit image of the shroud taken in 1978. And it shows clearly that the bands of discoloration from the weaving go right through the seam from the main cloth to the strip, showing that it was part of the original cloth, then torn off and then re-sewn back on again. Could this side strip be the missing cloth alluded to in John's Gospel?
Here's the side strip on the shroud.
Right.
Let me just show you. It's essentially the length of the actual shroud itself.
Right.
Okay? So we're going to use this to finish off what I'm proposing to
Explains that movement of the cloth.
So now remember, the bottom of the feet have blood on them.
Right.
And so that has to be held in place. So I'm going to take the bottom part. So let's put a small knot here at the bottom. And we're going to wrap this around, and we're going to make it rather tight because we have to hold the body together.
Exactly. So that's the bit that would have held the knees together.
Yeah. See what this is doing? It's going to hold the legs together, which holds the knees, which is what we observe on the shroud. Now that we've held.
The way the strip fastens the cloth around the body conforms to the way the body is represented on the shroud.
We're going to have to. When we look here at the bottom of the chin, notice the disruption that occurs in the cloth. I think that we can see that echoed if we go over here to the negative image.
Okay.
We can see the hair on either side of the face, but when we get down, it looks like the hair, suddenly there's a disruption, at least to my eye, and we see it over here. I think there's also a disruption in the beard. There's something here, and I would submit that that's consistent with what we are inducing by folding on the cloth here.
Jackson's side strip theory could answer the question that's puzzled students of the New Testament. I asked Jackson if he would submit his solution to an expert on John's Gospel in a real first-century tomb in Jerusalem itself. I've arranged for Dr. Jackson to present his theory to Dr. Stephen Need, a New Testament scholar.
This is just the sort of tomb that's referred to in the Gospels.
Jackson has laid out the body in the tomb, wrapped according to his reconstruction from the shroud, complete with the torn-off side strip tied around it. For accuracy, the Sudarium or face cloth that John's Gospel describes is also in position. Then, just before Dr. Need's arrival, the body is removed to leave just the cloths.
It's very striking to come into a real tomb in Jerusalem and to see the clothes lying there like that. It fits in with the Johannine picture, but if that piece of cloth that was torn off at the time of the burial was indeed a separate piece of cloth, that would explain the plural.
If Jackson is right, then this arrangement of burial cloths may be a closer representation of what John's Gospel says the disciples saw when they walked into the tomb on the third day after Jesus' death. The side strip links the Shroud of Turin to the Gospel of John and the 1st century AD. But perhaps the most direct evidence linking the Shroud of Turin to the time of Jesus is an archaeological find made in Jerusalem itself. I've come to the Israel Museum to hear about a discovery made in 1968. Archaeologists unearthed the remains of a victim of Roman crucifixion dating from the time of Jesus. The relevant find was a single heel bone which challenged the way we imagined crucifixion, and the museum has agreed to let me see it. Now, what Ellie has just handed to me is the only evidence that we have of the victim of a crucifixion. The key thing is that this nail did not go through the front of the foot, but through the side of the heel. Grooves on the victim's ulnar bone also show that he was nailed through the wrists. These finds overturn the convention that Jesus was nailed through the front of the feet and his palms. And so they're a benchmark for the true age of the shroud. Crucifixion disappeared along with the Roman Empire. Later artists showed the nails going through the front of the feet and the palms. I would expect a medieval forger to have followed the same convention. But if the method of crucifixion is distinctly Roman, then it's more likely to be from the time of Jesus. I've asked two specialists, Peter Dean, a forensic medical examiner, and Dr. Neil Svensson, an expert on the shroud, to assess whether the type of crucifixion represented on the image conforms to Christian iconography or to Roman methods of execution.
In this area,
there are the wounds you would expect to find from the descriptions in the Gospels. The scourging, for example. The shape and size match archaeological discoveries of the flagrum favored by the Romans in the 1st century. Likewise, the wound in the side matches the size and shape of the Roman lance. But for Dr. Svensson, the most telling details are the wounds where the body was nailed to the cross.
a Roman crucifixion began with fixing the arms at the crossbeam, called patibulum. And if we look at the man in the shroud, we see here at the wrists a big wound with blood rivulets in two directions.
It's interesting because I suppose when one thinks of the normal pictures and representations, one, I suppose, is used to seeing pictures of a nail through the palm itself, but here we're actually looking at the back surface of the wrist rather than the palm.
It's possible,
and
yes.
you get much more support if you're going through the bony structures of the wrist rather than, say, soft tissue in the palm, which may not be sufficiently capable of bearing weight.
The wounds on the feet also confirm that this was a Roman crucifixion.
The Romans crucify their victims by nailing them through the heel. And this man was pierced by the heel because we see a large outflow of blood from here.
The blood stains on the shroud are consistent with this practical way of nailing, the way we now know to be the Roman way. So no one has yet worked out how the image was formed. And there's evidence that places the shroud earlier in time. In the 12th century, in the 5th century, and even in the 1st century.
In Italy, 1978. The Church allows the most extensive scientific examination of the shroud to a group of scientists who call themselves STURP.
STURP was a non-profit organization set up to perform scientific studies on the Shroud of Turin. It stands for Shroud of Turin Research Project.
The scientists are determined to uncover the truth behind the shroud.
STURP made the most important research from a scientific point of view.
The scientists know that this is an historic event. And they have been waiting months for this moment.
The shroud was brought to us covered in red silk into the test room, which is the Royal Palace. The shroud was then transferred to the testing platform, and then we had to prepare it for the scientific testing.
The scientists only have 5 days to conduct their experiments. They work day and night to discover everything they can about the shroud. Some sleep, while others carry out even more experiments.
What we did were things like scientific photography. We would take photographs, color, black and white. We did microscopic photography, X-ray fluorescence measurements on the shroud. So the various atoms would glow with their characteristic set of X-ray emissions with a lot of spectral structure to them.
With time ticking away, the team shift gears from high to low-tech experiments.
We took sticky tape samples from the shroud, where you take sticky tape, non-contaminating tape, pressure-sensitive roller, so as to control the pressure. Adhering to the tape sample would be particles from the shroud.
After 120 hours of non-stop examinations, the clock runs out. And the shroud returns to the chapel for another decade. Colorado, USA, 1981. It has been 3 years since STURP conducted their tests. John Jackson and his team are finally able to release their findings.
We gave ourselves 3 years. We took a condition of secrecy because we didn't want to have half-baked stuff getting out there. So 3 years later, 1981, we then released all the information. We weren't searching for sensationalism. We thought that would be the responsible way to do it.
Professor Fanti is astonished at the findings. STURP tested whether a forger first painted the ghostly image of a man and then added red stains to simulate wounds to the body. But STURP find the red stains were definitely not paint. They were human blood.
The blood stains were incrustations, reddish incrustations on top of the cloth.
But did a forger splatter the blood across the cloth to create the wounds? Fanti does not see evidence of that. On the contrary, the blood distribution exactly matches the pattern of wounds Christ would have sustained during his crucifixion. A spear wound on one side of the chest, and across the body hundreds of cuts or scourge marks from a Roman flagrum.
Along the whole image, but in particular in this part of the dorsal image, we see the blood stains deriving from the scourge marks. 300 scourges along the whole body.
There was no evidence that an artist had forged the wound marks. But could a clever painter have forged the image of the body? If a forger had, then the paint should have soaked right through the shroud fibers. But when STURP examined the cloth, the body image was only on the very surface.
There was no obvious pigments making up the body image. The body image on the shroud lies only on the surface of the cloth. The color of the image, the body image, does not go through the thickness of the cloth.
Professor Fanti wants to see if he can himself confirm STURP's observation. He examines the shroud image with a microscope, down to the individual fibers.
So to try to understand the peculiarities of the shroud image, enlarge it about 300 times. We obtain this model.
This model represents one thread of the shroud. Each thread is made up with flex fibers.
In this model, we see about 100 flex fibers. Some of them are colored, image fiber, a red one, and not colored, this one.
If it had been painted, the entire thread would have been soaked through. Instead, only the top fibers are stained.
This is a very difficult task for a hypothetical painter, because we must think of one brush having one point smaller than the fiber. A fiber is about 15 micrometers.
The professor believes that the image resting on the microscopic fiber means a painter could not have created the shroud.
With this brush, he has to paint the front of the fiber, the back of the fiber, without touching the adjacent fiber. He would have to paint millions of fibers, one by one, in order to obtain these results. That is impossible.
For Fanti, STURP has shown that the shroud in all likelihood is not a forgery. But is it actually the burial cloth of Christ? The Vatican, Rome, 1988. It's 10 years since STURP's famous experiments, and people are now calling for a carbon dating test. They want to prove once and for all that the Shroud of Turin is from the time of Christ. But the Catholic Church refuses to play ball, as the test requires the shroud to be cut and the samples burned. After long and delicate negotiations, the Vatican at last gives permission.
Essentially, it's a dating method for living materials. So what you have to do is to get out the carbon that you're sure was in the object when it was first formed. In the case of textile, it would be the cotton fibres or the flax from which the material was made. And what you're actually dating is the growth of those fibres.
On the 21st of April 1988, under supervision of the Vatican, the shroud is cut. Samples are sent to 3 laboratories around the world, in Tucson, Oxford, and Zurich.
Normally, if you've got an object that you want to find the age of, you would send it to a single lab. But for something as controversial as this, I think the feeling was that you should have more than one lab doing the measurement independently to check that the results were similar.
The results are kept secret until October the 13th. It is then, with great fanfare, the results are announced to the world. The shroud is a forgery.
What it tells us pretty unequivocally is that the sample measured was medieval and within precision of a century or so.
All 3 labs reached the same conclusion with a 95% accuracy. The shroud originates from either the 13th or the 14th century. Fanti is devastated to read the headlines in the press.
I remember that I read many newspapers with their titles on the front page declaring that the shroud is a fake.
The results are also a blow for Christians all over the world.
Immediately after the carbon date results came out, there was a sense in which let's not bother exploring this cloth much more because, although it's very interesting, it is medieval and it doesn't relate directly to Jesus.
And anyone who dares question the carbon dating results faces ridicule.
Since the carbon dating, there is this sense in which people who believe in the shroud are flat earthers. So if you've got a professional reputation as a professor and you continue to explore and to examine the shroud, then obviously it can be difficult for you.
But it's not difficult for Professor Fanti. Since first laying eyes on this religious object, he is willing to do everything he can to discover the true age of the shroud. Padua, Italy, 1988. It's 10 years since the carbon dating test labeled the shroud a fake. But Fanti knows that the image on the cloth could not have been forged by a painter. This is a major contradiction. And something tells Fanti it's not the end of the story.
When I read this title, I was quite dubious. Something in my heart told me that the shroud was not a fake.
Fanti is prepared to carry out his own research, but he knows only too well that he cannot let his beliefs cloud his scientific work.
We have to proceed in a clear way, separating as much as possible scientific aspects from religious one. And this was the way I followed from the beginning.
Fanti suspects that somewhere along the line, there's been a mistake in the carbon dating. He wonders if anything in the shroud's history could have distorted the result. (1532). The shroud is stored in a chapel in the Alps. And one night, the chapel catches fire.
In 1532, the only damage to the shroud that has ever occurred that we know of took place. There was a raging fire in the chapel. At the time, the shroud was kept in a silver reliquary in a locked box. Strenuous attempts were made to rescue the shroud from the fire. By the time they'd managed to smash open the box, the heat inside was so intense that some of the silver had melted and had burnt through the shroud. So those burn holes can still be seen.
The shroud survives the fire. Steps were quickly taken to repair it, not with ancient thread from the time of Jesus, but with medieval thread.
Immediately after the fire, the shroud was given to an order of nuns. The nuns repaired the shroud. They mended the areas which are on the shroud by the image itself. They had to reweave some of the fibers of the shroud in order to repair the damage.
Fanti wonders if the samples in the carbon dating test contained thread from the Middle Ages and contaminated the result. Oxford, England. The home of the Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit, one of the labs that tested a sample from the shroud in 1988. Could the medieval carbon date be wrong? Although the tests destroyed the samples, the Oxford lab still has photos of them. Pam Moon, who, like Fanti, has doubts about the carbon dating result, asks the Oxford lab to release the photos. She wants to inspect the front and reverse image of the shroud sample.
The Oxford pictures have been really, really helpful in the sense that they're actually quite detailed. There's quite a lot that you can see in them.
The lab releases every single image that they have of that sample. As she carefully inspects the photos, Pam Moon spots some unusual signs.
At first glance, it looks like it's really good condition, but it looks like there's a shadow.
But a photograph of the reverse of this material reveals that this was not a shadow.
What it shows is that what looks like a bit of shadow is actually a deep stain, and there's staining all over the sample. It shows signs of hand weaving, invisible repair. It shows a different tension in different parts, heat damage, so it's shrunk. So obviously this is a hugely contaminated piece of cloth.
Fanti is convinced that discoveries like Pam's challenge the accuracy of the carbon dating result. He would love to see the carbon dating test rerun, but he can't. The original samples are gone, and for decades, the Vatican has refused to release any more shroud fragments.
From the carbon dating, officially there are not open experiments on the shroud. All was closed up to now.
Professor Fanti is facing a dead end. Without any material to test, he is unable to conduct his experiments. Can he find another way to discover the true age of the shroud. He goes back into history. He discovers an illustration of a shroud of Christ before the 14th century. A Hungarian text, the Prey Codex, has an image of Jesus lying on a shroud with its trademark herringbone weave. And on the shroud, within the Prey Codex, Fanti spots 4 circular marks. These are identical to marks found on the shroud. The Prey Codex is reliably dated to the 12th century, at least 100 years before the carbon date. It means the Turin shroud might have existed long before the carbon date says it did. It means the carbon date could be wrong. As Fanti delves further back through the archives, he discovers many other shroud-like images throughout history.
We know that there were images that look just like the shroud, that date to the 6th century.
And Fanti finds similarities in coins also made from around that time.
This coin represents the face of Christ that has many similarities with the shroud.
For Fanti, all these images are evidence that the shroud existed prior to the Middle Ages. And they convince him that the shroud dates back to the burial of Christ. But how can he prove it scientifically? Padua, Italy. Home to one of Italy's most prestigious universities. Fanti decides that to establish the correct date of the shroud, he can't work alone. There are many scientists around the world working on the shroud. So he decides to set up a group to get like-minded people together.
In 2002, I formed a group called Shroud Science. Shroud Science has many shroud researchers in the world.
Once in the group, Professor Fanti discovers there is only one way to get your hands on shroud material. And that's to contact STURP, the scientists from the 1978 Shroud of Turin research project.
The Vatican recognizes only samples coming from 1978, taken by STURP.
As head of the Shroud Science Group, the professor approaches every STURP scientist for samples. He waits for a reply. And one day, an envelope arrives.
The first sample was from Ray Rogers, who was not expert in sending samples.
Immediately, Fanti can see there is a problem.
He put a glass containing image fiber in a simple envelope. There was perhaps an accident during the transportation, and the glass arrived broken with the envelope opened.
If the fiber is gone, the professor's chance to conduct any experiments will be lost. He sifts through the glass, looking for any stray fibers.
Using my microscope, I was able to detect the fiber among the pieces of broken glass. I was very, very lucky to take the envelope and to find the image fiber was in there.
With this official piece of the shroud, the professor's experiments to date the shroud can begin. Inside the corridors of Padua University lies Professor Fanti's laboratory. And in here, Fanti finds himself in a unique situation. He possesses a piece of one of Christianity's most worshipped relics. The shroud has fascinated him all of his life. And now he is able to do what others could only dream of doing: run his own series of tests. Fanti devises 3 experiments, quite different to the carbon dating test.
I detected that there are some alternative methods able to make a date of the shroud.
Fanti believes the average of these tests will produce an accurate date.
I'd say it's essential to get as much diversity in your observations that you can to scientifically test a given hypothesis.
The first experiment is a load-bearing test. Every material has a certain strength. This strength degrades over time. How strong the shroud fiber is will show Fanti how old the material is. But such an experiment needs a very specialized machine.
We began to search a machine able to perform the tests. In general, there are many loading cycles machines in the world, but this machine makes tests on threads, not on short fiber like those of the shroud that are 1-2 millimeters long. I searched in the world, but it was not easy to satisfy this condition.
Eventually, Fanti builds his own machine.
So we designed, built, and calibrated a new machine that is able to make this test.
Fanti's machine tests the microscopic shroud fibers. Fanti's results are remarkable. The fiber is 900 years older than the carbon date.
In correspondence of the mechanical dating, we have 400 years old at a 95% confidence level. This was sufficient to demonstrate that the radiocarbon dating was wrong.
It's an astonishing reversal of fortunes for the shroud. But 400 AD is still hundreds of years after the burial of Christ. Can Fanti trace the shroud even further back? Fanti carries out his next 2 experiments. He uses an infrared spectrometer and a laser. These tests calculate how well the material reflects light. The older the material, the less it reflects it. Fanti runs the tests. Amazingly, the fiber reflects very little light. The fibers date to between 200 to 300 BC, 1,500 years older than the carbon dating test.
Step by step, we arrive to these results that we obtain. Every time we reach the good result, we were obviously happy.
Professor Fanti now has a range of new dates, radically different to the shroud's carbon date. All he needs to do is average his 3 findings. Fanti's final date is 33 BC. A result that places the shroud just before the time of Jesus. The world, at last, takes notice of Fanti's work. And it was also recognized by others who have researched the shroud.
I am aware that he gave a date that would be consistent with it being the burial cloth of Christ. Any research that points in that direction is just great from my point of view.
But for Fanti, it's not the end of his journey. He may have proved the shroud originated around the time of Christ's burial. But the greatest secret of the shroud still remains unanswered. How was the extraordinary image on the shroud created? When pilgrims come to Turin, they're mesmerized by the ghostly figure on the shroud. But the image on the cloth still puzzles believers and skeptics.
The Turin Shroud is a bit like the Loch Ness Monster, in that it has passionate supporters and skeptics on both sides. Those who say it's a fake have to explain how a medieval person could have created an image that modern science cannot replicate.
Fanti is determined to solve the mystery once and for all. Skeptics have suggested various techniques a forger could have used to make the image. Painting, photography, or even a chemical process. But none explain why the image only rests on the surface fibers of the cloth.
There are many hypotheses about the body image formation, but none of them are able to explain all what we see.
Fanti wonders what other natural process could have left such a shallow impression. As a professor in thermal imaging, Fanti is familiar with the effects of electricity. He's intrigued by the electrical or corona discharge created by a plasma ball. On a small cloth, it can create an image simply with an electrical charge over a 24-hour period.
Now, if I touch the sphere, we see a connection with my finger and a discharge. To reproduce an image like that of the shroud, we can use a linen cloth put on the sphere, and if with my hand I touch the linen, you can see the image on the sheet. If I stay for a while in this position, an image generates on the linen that has many characteristics that are very similar to that of the shroud.
But Fanti wants to see if the experiment works using a figure of Christ and a large cloth. That means increasing the charge to hundreds of thousands of volts.
It is a quite complex process. We need high voltages that generate the high electric fields that ionize the gas.
For days, Fanti works with deadly amounts of electricity. But the experiment ends in failure.
The first time I went to make the experiments, I was curious, but my curiosity stopped soon because the result was negative.
The charge has left no marks on the cloth at all. He tries again. This time Fanti turns up the power to nearly 100%. And he bombards the cloth with electricity for more than 24 hours. The adjustments work. When he returns, an image has formed.
It is necessary to calibrate very well the energy. Only in the range 97 98, it is possible to obtain an image.
When Fanti examines the image, he is amazed. It's the closest image he has ever seen to the one on the shroud.
The corona discharge gives us the most number of compatibility between the experimental results and what we see on the shroud.
It is 15 years since Fanti stood before the shroud asking for divine guidance. And it's even longer since a childhood trip triggered an obsession with the shroud. The results of his remarkable experiments are a vindication of his life-changing decisions. For Fanti, the Shroud of Turin is not a medieval forgery. It could very well be the burial cloth of Christ. But as he admires the relic, he can't help wondering if it is the Shroud of Christ. What in the 1st century AD could have produced such a massive electrical blast? As Fanti reviews his tests, the only hypothesis he can think of is also the most controversial. The blast was created by a divine miracle.
I think that the most important message of the shroud is that it enveloped a resurrected man.
Fanti believes that if the Turin shroud is the burial sheet of Christ, then it also depicts his resurrection.
If the Shroud of Turin is the burial cloth of Jesus, then it would be his resurrection cloth as well. Is that what the shroud is? Is that what it's telling us?
For Fanti, the shroud as a depiction of the resurrection is confirmation of his faith.
The demonstration that a second life after this life exists.